In his final years, well into his 90s, Paul Tibbets remained a striking figure. Silver hair crowned his head, and despite the weight of age upon his eyelids, his gaze burned with an intensity that time had failed to diminish. Though clearly elderly, he defied the typical frailty of 90 years. His posture stayed erect and dignified, his stride merely slowed rather than broken. Only his hearing had truly surrendered to age, leaving him nearly stone deaf. Everything about him spoke of a life lived on grand stages, a man who had not merely witnessed history but had perhaps danced with greatness itself. And indeed, he had done precisely that. Though fewer than 1 in 10,000 Americans could identify his name if asked, Paul Warfield Tibbets, Jr. stood among the most recognizable figures of the 20th century. History remembers him as the man who dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, though technically this description contains an error. Bomber pilots command aircraft while bombardiers release weapons, and in this case, the late Tom Farabee actually triggered the bomb's release. But it was the often difficult and abrasive General Tibbets who flew the plane that day, and history would forever credit him with, or condemn him for, what many consider warfare's single most significant act. Throughout his adult life, Tibbets had been nothing short of extraordinary. From his earliest days, he radiated a self-confidence that frequently crossed into insufferable territory. He possessed zero tolerance for mediocrity and even less for foolishness. Tibbets lived as an absolutist, convinced that his way was the only correct path forward. Such unwavering certitude, delivered with considerable attitude, could prove overwhelming, and Tibbets was admittedly too much for most people to handle comfortably. From his graduation day at Western Military Academy in North Alton, Illinois, through every subsequent chapter of his life, Tibbets excelled at every assignment without exception. His father had envisioned a medical career for his son, but young Paul's dreams belonged to the sky. During the Depression years, only one realistic path existed for people of modest means to become pilots: enrollment in the Aviation Cadet program. With his mother's blessing, but against his father's bitter condemnation, Paul pursued this course and graduated at the top of his class. Unlike his peers who chose fighter training when given the option, he followed his tactical officer's advice and selected observation flying. This decision would prove monumentally consequential. Pilots generally fall into two categories: those who master flight through sheer determination and hard work, and those rare individuals for whom the sky seems their natural domain. Two phrases describe these exceptional aviators: born to fly and real stick and rudder manual. Both descriptions fit Paul Tibbets perfectly. Not only was he gifted, he belonged to that exclusive handful who could coax aircraft into maneuvers their designers never imagined possible. Beyond piloting skill lay the military dimension. Those who have never served in the regular military struggle to grasp the concept of command presence. This quality refers to someone with innate characteristics who, seemingly without effort, compels others to follow into mortal danger. Civilians constantly attempt to equate this military phenomenon with some form of exceptional management skill, but this comparison fails utterly. Management skills can be taught through instruction. Command presence emerges from one's genetic makeup. Paul Tibbets possessed this indefinable quality in abundance. Being supremely competent is one achievement, but having that competence recognized and accepted by those whose lives depend upon your decisions represents an entirely different magnitude of accomplishment. General Tibbets, as fate decreed, ultimately held a transforming world in his hands. He was precisely the right man for the mission. The summer of 1944 found the United States 2.5 years deep into World War II. What had the nation accomplished in those 30 months? In a single phrase: the creation of an air force, quite literally from nothing. When Pearl Harbor suffered its bombing, Paul Tibbets held the rank of newly promoted captain. Though his rank remained modest, he possessed an asset in desperate demand: more than 1,000 hours of multi-engine flying time. In December 1941, such experience was rare regardless of rank. After several months bouncing between assignments due to bureaucratic confusion, Captain Tibbets joined the original cadre of the 97th Bomb Group in Tampa, Florida. The 97th was destined to become the first heavy bomb group in what would be known as the mighty 8th Air Force in England, though that distinction lay far in the future. During early 1942, So few qualified pilots existed for the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress that Tibbets spent late winter and spring simply teaching newly minted multi-engine pilots basic flight operations. Not combat flying, merely how to avoid killing themselves during routine operations. The newly created Army Air Force was truly that small. By the time orders came for the 97th to deploy to the United Kingdom, the newly promoted Major Tibbets commanded a squadron. Consider that just 6 months earlier, this same man had been a first lieutenant who had never commanded anyone. Upon reaching England, the group moved to a base called Polbrook. Almost immediately, several command-level officers were relieved of duty, and the group commander was replaced by Colonel Frank Armstrong. Armstrong proved a superb leader, but carried one significant handicap. He had never flown a B-17. For historical perspective, it's crucial to understand that the Army Air Corps had become the Army Air Force only a year prior. This name change transcended mere formality. It represented historic transformation. The Army Air Force was struggling to evolve from an adjunct service into a legitimate force. Air power was coming of age, and military leadership was still determining how to maximize its potential. One fact, however, was becoming abundantly clear. A severe shortage of command-level officers existed to lead this explosive growth. In his autobiography Global Mission, General Henry Hap Arnold described the situation in stark terms. When they lost one senior or command-level officer, he was almost irreplaceable. The 1949 film 12 O'Clock High contains a scene where Brigadier General Frank Savage selects and promotes an acerbic Major Cobb to Group Air Executive Officer. The motion picture compiles events from mid-1942 through February 1943, based loosely on General Frank Armstrong's relationship with the 97th and 306 bomb groups. The Major Cobb incident depicts actual events, and the real Major Cobb was in truth Paul Tibbets. In July 1942, when Colonel Armstrong assumed command of the 97th, he required instruction in flying the B-17. Paul Tibbets served as his mentor. When on August 17th of that year, the 97th flew the first B-17 bombing mission over German-occupied France, Armstrong received credit for leading it. In fact, Colonel Armstrong occupied the co-pilot's seat of the lead aircraft, not yet qualified for the left seat. The man truly commanding the raid was Paul Tibbets. When the 97th Bomb Group transferred to North Africa as part of Operation Torch, Tibbets was selected to fly General Mark Clark to Gibraltar for secret meetings with Vichy French officials. Weeks later, he was tasked with flying General Dwight D. Eisenhower to the Rock to command the invasion. When the group transferred to Biskra, Tunisia, in November 1942, they received yet another new commander, Colonel Hamp Atkinson. When Colonel Atkinson fell ill from some malady contracted in the desert, Lieutenant Colonel Tibbets became, for all practical purposes, the acting commander of the 97th Bomb Group. Just 1 year earlier, Tibbets had been a first lieutenant. Both Frank Armstrong and Hamp Atkinson reached brigadier general rank by early 1943, and both stated publicly that they owed their stars in significant measure to Paul Tibbets. As typically occurs, personalities impact individual careers, and Paul Tibbets' career proved no exception. Loris Norstad possessed impeccable credentials but lacked combat or field command experience. He had earned a superb reputation as a staff officer and early in his career had allied himself with Hoyt Vandenberg's Rising Star. Both men reflected and complemented the highest ideals of what remained a developing service. Vandenberg was nephew to the single most powerful Republican senator on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Norstad served as his supremely capable aide-de-camp. During the war, General Arnold commanded the Air Corps and Air Force. He pursued a mission to create a service capable of standing independently. He accomplished this partly by eliminating, often brutally, weak commanders. Sometimes this appeared done on whim, with very junior men promoted based on seemingly insubstantial or short-term accomplishments. However, Arnold's judgment proved uncannily accurate. In January 1944, his replacement of General Ira Eaker, a lifelong friend, with General Jimmy Doolittle seemed rash at first glance. In retrospect, it demonstrated genius. Doolittle had achieved superior results with fewer resources in the Mediterranean theater, and Eisenhower trusted him completely. Friendship be damned. This same results-based weighing led to Paul Tibbets' command of the 509th, The pure facts dictated that no other officer of similar rank had accomplished what he had in such a brief period. If Norstad disliked him, that was simply unfortunate. His record spoke eloquently for itself. In early 1943, Tibbets received assignment to General Doolittle's headquarters. There he clashed with Colonel Norstad, a confrontation that would shadow Tibbets throughout his Air Force career. Tibbets was reassigned to stateside duty, removed from harm's way by the politically connected and vindictive Norstad. By late winter and early spring 1943, no other officer in the Air Force possessed Tibbets' combat leadership experience. In fewer than 6 months, he had flown 37 combat missions, most of them as mission or group commander, if not officially, then in practice. When Tibbets received assignment to the Boeing B-29 Superfortress bomber program, General K.B. Wolfe commanded what became known as the Battle of Kansas. Wolfe was a logistics expert. Tibbets became head of the Service Flight Test Program and de facto operations officer. He was the one who had to fly and approve what was at best a troublesome aircraft, and at worst an underpowered death trap. Throughout the entire program, hardly a day passed when he didn't risk his life in the effort to bring the B-29 into combat readiness. Tibbets became arguably the single most competent and experienced combat bomber pilot in the United States Air Force. By summer 1944, he was the most experienced and knowledgeable B-29 pilot alive. Thus, when the time arrived to select a commander for the 509th Composite Group, Tibbets topped the list to head a nascent atomic bombing unit. The 28-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Tibbets carried 2 significant negatives on an otherwise sterling resume. He had endured what would prove to be a career-ending clash with a powerful, politically connected superior, and he possessed a personality that served as a godsend during wartime, but proved anything but during peace. In July 1944, neither factor mattered. He was first and foremost an achiever of assigned tasks. In 10 months, he formed and trained his unit and executed his mission flawlessly. Never before and never since has an officer of even remotely similar rank been granted either the authority or the responsibility that accompanied Operation Silverplate. For the duration that General Tibbets commanded the 509th, he occupied a singular position, unique to this day, in the history of American military arms. In subsequent years, Tibbets undertook other daunting, if less historic missions. He headed the B-47 Service Test Program. He commanded SEC wings and air divisions. After retirement, he served as president of a corporate jet taxi service. In each instance, he assumed control of troubled programs and swiftly corrected them. Once the war concluded, inevitable questions arose. Was dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima truly necessary? There emerged what amounted to a cottage industry of victor's guilt that to this day resists rational categorization. The arguments ranged from seemingly reasonable to absolutely absurd. Over recent years, Tibbets attempted to place his reputation in proper historical context. The forces arrayed against him were numerous, powerful, and unrelenting. He confronted those with differing perspectives, some revisionist historians, and others who had drawn conclusions based at least partly on political agendas. People with no comprehension of what Tibbets was asked to do or why sometimes seemed to pass judgment on him as though they understood. He was caught on the horns of a dilemma that only he uniquely comprehended. In the twilight of his life, he wished to be understood for who he was, and more precisely, for his proper place in history. While an issue is being settled through war, the most violent and immoral fashion imaginable, those who do the settling are glorified. The moment the matter is resolved, some of those not involved in the combat begin to recast the event in moralistic and humanistic terms. The two perspectives are historically irreconcilable. War and removed dispassion maintain a disconnect that cannot be bridged. Paul Tibbets became the ultimate victim of this abyss. He was a man born of an era of rectitude. For reasons probably even he didn't fully understand, he carried this old-time religion to something of an extreme. But that was exactly what the task set before him required. He was the almost perfect exemplar of the right man, in the right place, at the right time. His guard remained perpetually raised. When he could spend a day as an unrecognized elder citizen, he was as mellow as a man of his temperament could manage. This occurred most of the time. When he was on display, as it were, he became defensive, and not without reason. Consider these facts. He was the man who led America's first heavy bomber mission over occupied Europe, yet he was bereft of honors. He was the man who led the operational portion of the B-29 service test program, which was quite literally a no-win situation. He was the man who created, trained, and led the 509th Composite Group in the atomic bombing mission. For this, some reviled him. He was the man who led the Air Force B-47 service test program in Project Wyback in the late 1940s and brought the airplane into operation a year and a half ahead of schedule. He was the man who in 1956 took over a failing SEC wing, the 308th, and transformed it from the worst in the 2nd Air Force to the best. 2.5 years later, he repeated this performance with the 6th Air Division at McDill Air Force Base. Upon retirement, he took over a failing jet taxi company, Executive Jet, and created the world's largest and most successful executive charter service. Historically, one is left to ponder what more one man could do in service to his country. Paul Tibbets was about as good as a great nation could ask. Would that there were more like him. At a time and place when great resolve and ability were most needed, he stood in the breach. It is not too hyperbolic to say that for a brief moment in time, the fate of the world was placed in his hands. Paul Tibbets did not flinch, and he was not found wanting. The historical status he merits is not the one he holds. In the case of the 2 atomic attacks, the salient points emerge clearly. President Roosevelt was informed in 1939 that extreme possibilities existed in the form of a superweapon within the application of nuclear power as it related to the fission of certain materials. It was known that Germany was working on such a project. In 1942, work was sufficiently advanced to move beyond concept and begin creating a practical weapons system to build and deliver an atomic bomb. By the time of the Trinity test, the United States had spent 2.5 years and over $2 billion on a supposedly war-ending weapon. In April 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was succeeded in office by Vice President Harry S. Truman. Upon accession to the presidency, Truman knew nothing of the Manhattan Project. Given his short time in office, he availed himself of what he perceived to be the best available advice regarding the bomb's use. When Truman took office, these were the global war facts as known at that time. Germany had been a beaten nation for at least a year, yet it had fought on until the entire country was overrun, at a cost of at least another 6 million lives in that final year of European war. The general consensus among powers in Washington and in the field was that Japan was a more adamant foe than Germany. Although Japan was losing the island war in the Pacific theater, it maintained an army of 1.5 million men that was still all-conquering on the Asian mainland in China. The conquest of the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa gave every indication that defense of the home islands would be a bloodbath beyond description. When one considers that President Truman had inherited what was perceived to be a possibly war-ending program, the Manhattan Project, that had been started by a predecessor widely held to be a national treasure and today considered by many to be the greatest president of the 20th century, it is inconceivable that this unknown man from Missouri would cast aside the resulting weapon and let the killing continue for an indefinite period. Had Truman demurred and let the war continue for whatever time it would have taken, and then word leaked out, as surely it would have, that they had possessed and did not use a possibly war-ending weapon, he would have been impeached in short order, and rightfully so. Anyone who takes a stance contrary to this action simply does not understand the government of the United States, the attitude of the nation in 1945, or how democracies work. Given the times, the decision to drop the bomb was, in today's parlance, a no-brainer. Truman had no choice and neither did Paul Tibbets. They both did their duty, and by so doing, the killing stopped at 54 million. The author met General Tibbets in 1997. He was making a tour of the country to promote a painting of the famed B-29 named Enola Gay on its historic mission. The venue was a hangar at the airport in Salem, Oregon. Upon arrival at the facility, the author was struck by the fact that most people who came had no notion of what he looked like. They knew him by reputation alone. The author knew exactly who to look for and spotted him across the hangar walking slowly, examining the artwork on display. If one can be 80-plus years old and still be described as fiery, Paul Tibbets was that man. Any stranger who approached him was presumed to be hostile until proven otherwise. When the author presented himself, he was not just cordial, but deferential. He had what he thought was the ideal icebreaker. One of Tibbets' officers in the 509th had been his squadron commander in SAC. Moreover, that officer had been the Air Force technical advisor in the making of the film Above and Beyond. Still, he was treated with what amounted to hostility. Fortunately, he was prepared for it. Any good historian knows his subject. He understood where Tibbets was coming from. While they couldn't be said to have parted on a plane of friendship, when they parted, having accomplished his goals, Tibbets was at least no longer in a defensive posture. The parting handshake was more than a mere formality. General Tibbets passed away November 1, 2007.